Slaveholders maintained absolute control over their slaves. As a means of social control, punishment was felt to be most effective. Violation of the norms set by the slaveholder was met with a variety of forms of punishment. Stamp describes some of the more ingenious methods. A Maryland tobacco grower forced a hand to eat the worms he failed to pick off the tobacco leaves. A Mississippian gave a runaway wretch time by requiring him to sit at the table and eat his evening meal with the white family. A Louisiana planter humiliated disobedient male field hands by giving them women's work, such as washing clothes, by dressing them in women's clothing, and by exhibiting them on a scaffold wearing a red flannel cap. Not only did they use violence, they used emotional and mental warfare. They beat them, they dressed them up like women and demoralized them. That is the reality of what happened. Frederick Douglass, the next slave who became an abolitionist, writer, and minister to Haiti, recalled that the first slaveholder on whose plantation he lived frequently engaged in acts of cruelty towards his slaves. For example, I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back, till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran the fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush. And not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I know there's a lot of protests around the nation, even the world at this point, against police brutality. As I said in the last one, I'm not necessarily anti-cop and all that stuff. It's anti-brutality. We had a history of overseers beat black people. Now we have a history of officers beat black people. This is not a debate. These are just facts. And I'll get to when officers are a thing, because right now it's just overseers in the South. But historically, it's dark. It's a reality. And I'll dare anyone who listens this far or who disagrees with, oh, they're just rioters, oh, it's just blah, blah, blah. Find me one period in time, one community whose officers engaged the community and reconciled the actions that they did years ago. Has anyone ever apologized about sicking dogs on peaceful protesters back in the 60s and 50s? Has anyone reconciled the black people who were just beaten in the streets or lynched? No, it happened, right? And even so, officers were there doing it and allowing it to happen. It's the dark history. And again, I'll say it again, I'm not anti-cop in that context of abolish the police and get rid of everything. To me, I think that's not a solution. The reallocation of funds, yeah, okay, that makes sense. We got to say that louder because people cling on to hot topic words. But there has to be more that we can do to move forward. But we can't move forward until we truly understand the past and understand why people are acting the way they are, because historically they're fed up. You've beaten, like as an example or as an analogy, you've beaten my grandfather, you've beaten my father, you will not beat me. I've learned their lessons, I've seen their scars. I will overcome this by any means necessary. That is a very dominant mentality that I'm seeing in communities, that I'm hearing echoed by these people who are in these protests. Stamp cites many examples of psychopathic slaveholders who thoroughly enjoyed the practice of inflicting extreme brutality on their slaves. Because slaves represented an important capital investment in the plantation economy, slaveholders naturally protected their investment. And some reports of the retaliations between the slaves and the slaveholders indicate ambivalent feelings on the part of the latter. Many of them developed affectionate relations towards their slaves, but this affection was always tempered by antipathy. Not the greatest reader. For whoever listens to this, I hope you are listening to this with an open mind. Yes, when I'm looking at the camera and I'm talking, I'm giving my opinion and my thoughts to a degree. But when I'm looking down and I'm reading this is just historical context. These are just things that happened. By the end, I'll give you books like read by Frederick Douglass, The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, released back in 1960. Stamp, Franklin, I've cited their books already. I'll be citing the books of the people I'm quoting in this. And again, this book was written in the 1960s. How much has changed? It's been 60 years. 51 years since 1969? How much has really changed? On small plantations, slaves encountered direct contact with the slaveholders. On larger plantations, overseers were hired to maintain discipline among the slaves. Overseers were generally recruited from among the poorer whites, a class not known from its admiration of the slaves. Their treatment of slaves was indicative of the low esteem in which they held these people. On plantations where overseers were employed, cruelty and brutality were institutionalized. Now, I think I saw an argument the other day that kind of caught my attention with like, police need more training, right? As a solution, like to move forward, instead of just saying defund them, you need more training. So more training means more funding, et cetera, et cetera. But also, one argument that I saw in that train of thought was, why is it that officers can just be officers straight out of high school? You don't need a college degree. You go through training, you go through basic training, and boop, you're a cop. And in some professions, you need more training than you do need to be an officer. And that's just not to say in any context of disrespect, but it's just the context of reality. The amount of training to be one profession is not as equivalent to the amount of training for another. And one of the arguments in this is, why do we allow these undereducated people to become officers instead of requiring them to be college educated and all that stuff? And it's the same arguments are made for the military. You need these people straight out of high school, boom, 18 years old, get them in uniform, get them trained, get them out there into the military, because they'll listen, they'll obey, they'll conform to the norms of what you have to do to survive, right? But isn't it interesting how the same mentality was used for overseers? These poorer whites, these uneducated whites, they were hired. So remember, if you don't own land, chances are you're poor, right? Because you don't own land. Back in the Americas, you needed money. You need to work for somebody. Who did you work for? The people with land. People with land aren't going to pay you to pick cotton because they have slaves to do it for free forever, right? But they don't want the slaves to run away. They don't want the slaves to rebel, right? Because all this fear. So they hire you to keep them in line. Isn't that the same argument that we're hearing from the black communities in some aspects of how they see police officers? And personally, I have a good amount of friends on here who are cops, and I hope you see this too, so we can talk about it and figure out what's a better solution. Because what's happening now is not working. But think about that degree in the context of you're being used to perpetuate and keep in line the community, right? The overseer kept the slave in line, and to a degree, police officers are used to keep the people in line in the community. Ain't that fucked up? Because if you're there to protect the community, it becomes this bigger dichotomy of a thought process. All right. Although many religious leaders ultimately adopted anti-slavery positions, most of them perceived of slavery as being divinely sanctioned and thereby a natural condition. Most slaveholders approved of religious training for their slaves, but a series of codes developed whereby religious services were rigidly regulated. One of the most universal of these practices was that Negroes were prohibited from becoming ministers. Services were conducted by white ministers who interpreted their function as one of teaching the slaves to adjust to their condition of servitude. Frequently, slaves were required to attend the church of the slaveholder. Through the medium of the church, slaveholders sought to maintain slavery intact. Again, they were using religion as a tool of control to keep the Africans in line because they were slaves, to keep them subservient to what was happening. A lot of this historical background is hard to read, but it's the reality that we are living in, and it's the reality of the effects from then to now. Overseers, officers, politicians, ministers, they always want to try and keep people in line to stay in power and to stay in control. Understanding that gives you a better perception of what is happening. Thank you, Haifa. And thank you, Haifa, again. I'll take a mini break as you jumped in this conversation. Thank you for teaching me so much. Sincerely. Now, thinking about religion, and again, history is facts. These things happened. The perceptions of why they happened can be debated, but at the end of the day, they happened. The preachers right there, the Negroes were not allowed to be ministers, so they had to listen to the white ministers. Now tell me, if you get a minister to come to your plantation, don't you kind of get to pick out which one comes? If you have a minister who's preaching anti-slavery, are you going to invite them? Or are you going to invite the preacher who's going to keep your slaves in line? Just like the education system. Think about that for today. We say, oh, they're getting indoctrinated. Cool. How are we going to change that? Look at who's becoming teachers, look who's never retiring as a teacher, and look at the students like myself who gave up on being teachers because the process and the economics of being one is infuriating and not sustainable. It is not worth it to bust your ass, to go to school and do all these things and be so positive for the community and then be broken down and molded into a system in which you have to teach conformity. Are we truly educating one another? Or are we teaching to a test? These are the same arguments that have happened for time and time again, and look at the obedience that was precipitated by the preachers to the slaves. Because remember, a lot of these places in Africa and all these African cultures, they were not monotheistic for the most part, but they were forced here to be monotheistic and follow your God. And if they did not, you killed them. You beat them until they believed it. At first, remember, as I said in the last video, if you conform to Christianity, you could be freed. And that's what happened. Up until a point where they decided Africans are going to be enslaved and we're just going to leave them as that. And again, I'm just reading this book. It's just history facts. And it breaks my heart to say that in these 36 pages, it goes in through 400 years of African history in Americas. But think about it. All the things that I've covered, I'm on page 11. Where is it? As Franklin has written, compelling the Negro slaves to attend church with the slaveholder was the method the whites employed to keep a closer eye on the slaves. Slaveholders employed ministers who instructed slaves to be obedient and subservient. Bishops and other religious leaders themselves frequently owned slaves. For example, an the bishop, I'm sorry, not the greatest reader. The bishop in Louisiana owned 400 slaves. Although slaveholders were generally responsible for the religious life of their slaves and the selection of clergymen to preach to the slaves, they had little difficulty finding allies among the clergy. It was commonplace that the scriptures were employed to justify slavery, and many books were written in its defense. Not that the books existed, they wrote these books from scratch to perpetuate why slavery is okay. The Candace Owens, the Ben Shapiros, these people who talk this talk and write these books to make you feel better about it being okay. These are criminals, lock them away. That is the same thing that has happened. Ooh, erase history, the Devil Punch Bowl in Louisiana. It's captured in the video. Look it up, read it, understand it. Thank you, Haifa. In general, the clergymen with whom the slaves came into contact were men who used their religion as a means of maintaining the status quo. How much has changed in 400 years? Yeah, Rikers Island, named after enslaver and slave hunter. Remember if you notice, I'm seeing overseers, because right now I'm back in the 1600s, early 1700s. America's not a thing yet. These are British colonies, these are in the Americas, but you see the institution of slavery becoming so powerful that that's the backbone of society, right? You see how at first it's the slave owner doing everything, and then when she gets rich and powerful enough, he hires the poor white people in the community who don't have land, but see themselves as superior to the African Americans to be the overseers to keep them in line, aka the officers, right? And then you have the clergymen, the people turn to religion like, oh my God, why is this happening? Turn to God. And God is telling you, this is okay. This is what's supposed to happen. You are a slave. This is where you belong. It's all becoming institutionalized into the context that you remain where you are. You band together, you understand your languages, they trade it away. You are not human, you are property. And it's interesting in the concept too. If you put a price on a human life, which they did, I wonder if anyone could sit down and research the amount of property damage done by the white overseers, by the white plantation owners, by the slave owners, by the United States of America. Because if they're seeing them as property, but you want to crap about the property being broken today, let's think about it. Think about the concept in which you're angry about. And again, today, personally, I'm not for the breaking of property. It's not worth it. But who owns the property? Well, even when they destroy the black businesses, that's heart-wrenching. But understanding it's deeper. There's a reason behind this rationale. Again, doesn't make it right. But when you break it down, you can understand the context of which all of this is happening. I'm probably going to read this one last part called the Reactions of Slaves. Owners of slaves, supporters of slavery, and the believers in the innate inferiority of the Negro justified the institution on a variety of grounds. One such ground was that slaves, being docile and childlike, approved of their status. One argument you hear on the news, especially Fox News, is how they're acting like children, and how they are irrational, on how they're uneducated. These are the same perceptions used against slaves, against slavery, to enforce that it's okay that they're less than you. They cited the infrequency of serious insurrections and the failure of those which were planned to support their contention that the slaves were indeed happy with their lot in life. Evidence which failed to support their contention was generally ignored. That their beliefs were not rooted in reality is evidenced by the extreme measures which they were forced to resort to in order to maintain slavery. Slave revolts occurred in the earliest records of the period and continued throughout the era. Indeed, Evidence indicates that the slave traders in Africa experienced constant resistance to capture from the slaves, and numerous revolts by slaves are reported during the Middle Passage between Africa and the New World. In addition, many thousands of slaves managed, often against extraordinary odds, to escape from chattel slavery. The slaves reacted to their status with constant attempts to alter it. Meant that throughout the period they managed to be a troublesome property. For slaveholders, attempts to gain freedom took many forms, two of which were insurrections and fleeing from captivity. These are not a weak people. These are people who resisted by all means to fight back and be free. These are people who wanted to unite back to their families, in which they had no idea which way to go because they were brought to a different continent, thousands of miles away from home, and fought tooth and nail to return to it, to create something new even when they were here, to stay unified and to stay strong. These are the communities that we even see today. We see it in Yonkers. We see it in the Bronx. I see it here in New Mexico. You have community members wanting to band together and become stronger. And what happens? We get torn in different directions. Oh, you don't believe my religion. Oh, you don't believe this. Oh, you don't have a Honda. Oh, you don't have a truck. All these little differences are aimed to just disunify us. If we stop for a second and listen, we have more in common than we think we do. The media, the president right now, everything's so divisive, and it does not need to be that way. We are all in this planet together. We're all in this country together. You are all in the community with those around you. I would invite every single person to say hello to the next person they see when they're walking by. When you see that homeless person on the street, have a conversation with them. They have a family. No one's here alone. Although some 250 slave insurrections and conspiracies are reported to have occurred in the history of American Negro slavery, and although some of these were more serious than others, the history of slavery in North America is not without widespread popular revolts on the parts of slaves. The first such revolt as early as 1663, and such uprisings continued throughout the slavery era. Some revolts were well planned and organized, and others were haphazard planned. The 250 revolts reported involved numbers estimated as ranging from 10 to 50,000 slaves. Comprehend that these are only the ones that are reported, the ones that are documented. Braids were used as a form of protest. Clothing, languages, the knots in a rope. They didn't let you communicate by regular means. If you spoke the same language, they sold one of you off. They killed one of you. They did not want you unifying because at the end of the day, we are the majority and they are the minority. You had slave owners. That one clergyman that I spoke about earlier had 400 slaves. That one clergyman had 400 slaves. If you wanted a revolt, who's truly going to win? We are. Because we, the people, are the foundation of what this country is supposed to be. But as you see in the history of the foundation of this country, before this country even existed or was a thought, they always aim to suppress us. Stop suppressing one another and listen. And if you're getting this far in the video, you disagree with me, talk to me. I love being wrong. Educate me as well. I will listen. But what I'm presenting right now are partially my thoughts and mostly just historical context of what has happened in this country. Right now, I'm still like in the 1660s. When I get up to the 1800s or 1900s, it completely shifts to be modern. But this book does end by the 1950s. Let's continue. Three of the many slave revolts stand out because of the seriousness of the attempts, the number of slaves involved, and the reaction they generated throughout slaveholding North America. In 1800, a slave named Gabriel, a worker on a plantation near Richmond, Virginia, who perceived of himself as having a divine mission, organized the first major slave insurrection in North America. Gabriel is said to have possessed unusual intelligence. Let's stop right here for a second, because I've already read this book or this chapter for the most part, and it's interesting how when you have a slave or an African American who seems to be well put together, they always highlight their intelligence, their unusual intelligence. Because how could you be intelligent if you didn't get proper education? Education by what? By your standards? I continue. For weeks he met on Sundays with fellow slaves at parties and dances. On those occasions he selected special slaves to serve as assistants to work on plans with him. Gabriel picked what he felt to be the most advantageous date for the insurrection. The plan called for the use of few weapons. They were to murder the slaveholders and their families on the nearby plantations. Initially, all whites were to be killed, but as the revolt spread, landless whites were to be recruited to fight against wealthy landowners. The concept Gabriel was having was for the poor and the disenfranchised to unite and battle the rich. Strategy was mapped for the spread of the revolt and the enlistment of additional slaves into Gabriel's army. Gabriel had been inspired to insurrection by reading the Bible and by the French Revolution. It is reported that he was said to have planned to buy a piece of silk cloth to have the egalitarian slogan, "Liberty or Death," printed on it. This is in the 1800s. The revolt never materialized because two fellow slaves on the plantation informed the slave rebels, and the organizers and other participants were killed. Your own. People who did not see themselves to fight for the freedom because they liked the way it is or they felt what they were getting was not too bad. How often does this happen with the middle class? How often does this happen with your fellow people in your community? Even your family members. Oh no, everything's fine. Oh, I don't want to vote. Oh, this is fine. It's not my problem. It is. If one suffers, we all suffer. We are all in this together. And for some, they like the way it is because they're benefiting of it.